In the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, as the war in Europe reached its violent end, one of the Reich's most feared henchmen simply vanished. The man was Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, which had functioned as Germany's secret state police. Amid this chaos, Müller was last seen in the command bunker with high-level leaders on the evening of May 1st, 1945. He was calm but determined, reportedly declaring, "I have no intention of being taken prisoner by the Russians." Then, like a ghost, Heinrich Müller simply disappeared, and no confirmed trace of him has ever been found. To this day, he remains the highest level official of the Third Reich who has never been found. Heinrich Müller was not a household name during the Third Reich era, at least not to the general public, but within the corridors of the police state he was both respected and feared. Born in 1900 and hardened by service as a combat pilot in World War I, Müller joined the Munich police after that war. He earned a reputation as an aggressive investigator, especially against communists, unconstrained by legal norms or mercy. This caught the attention of party leaders, including Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, architects of the Third Reich's internal security apparatus. By 1939, he had become the chief of the Gestapo, answering directly to Heydrich and later Himmler. As Gestapo chief, Müller was deeply involved in the darkest crimes of the Third Reich and was a key organizer of political repression and terror. From his desk, this cold bureaucrat directed the persecution of anyone deemed an enemy of the state. But this video isn't the history of the Gestapo, so let's jump ahead to 1945. The Allies began rounding up surviving leaders of the Reich, and the search for Heinrich Müller commenced almost immediately. But from the start, investigators found only frustration. In the summer of 1945, Allied war crimes teams scoured Berlin for clues to Müller's fate. They questioned former colleagues and combed through charred records. A few leads emerged, with some eyewitnesses claiming that he had been seen fleeing the bunker. To complicate matters, Heinrich Müller was a painfully common name in Germany. Tracking sightings of a middle-aged, nondescript man named Heinrich Müller is the equivalent to issuing an alert to be on the lookout for John Smith. Numerous men shared the name, and some even matched the former chief's general description. Through the late 1940s, American and British intelligence agencies continued to pursue any hint of Müller. They searched the home of his former mistress in 1947 and monitored mail and communications, hoping the fugitive might contact his loved ones. But there was only silence, and by the end of the decade, as the Cold War set in, priorities shifted. Hunting down former Third Reich officials was no longer the top mission, as the West came into rapid conflict with the Eastern Bloc. As years passed, Heinrich Müller's fate became the subject of myriad theories, some plausible, others bordering on fantastical. During the Cold War, both the Western and Eastern blocs found it useful to stoke rumors about the missing Gestapo chief. In the 1950s, whispers circulated that Müller might have been taken by the Soviet Union. It wasn't an absurd idea. The NKVD, Soviet intelligence, had captured numerous officials and scientists. Some speculated that his techniques on internal repression were of interest to Stalin, and that he may have been brought in to train secret police in the Soviet Union. Even Walter Schellenberg, a former high-ranking intelligence officer, wrote in his memoir that Müller had supposedly defected to the USSR in 1945 and was later seen in Moscow. No concrete evidence ever emerged for this, but the mere notion was chilling. This man, who was responsible for immense suffering, may still be up to his old tricks. The flip side of this rumor appeared in propaganda as well. Soviet and East German sources occasionally hinted that Müller had actually escaped to the West. In the disinformation tug of war, Each side implied the other might be sheltering this notorious war criminal. The dramatic capture of Eichmann in 1960, Miller's subordinate in the Gestapo, reignited hope that Miller could also be found. If Eichmann could hide in Argentina for 15 years and then be caught, perhaps Miller was out there too. During interrogation, Eichmann himself reportedly said he believed his old boss was still alive, but either couldn't or wouldn't provide any further details. This tantalizing hint spurred new investigations in West Germany. Authorities put Muller's remaining family and former associates under surveillance for any sign of contact, but again, nothing definitive surfaced. For a long time, the dominant theory, by process of elimination, was that Heinrich Miller most likely died during the fall of Berlin in 1945. It seemed a reasonable conclusion. Many high-ranking German officials chose death over capture, and Muller had explicitly said he would do so. A high-level Polish defector claimed, in 1961, that the Soviets had taken him to Moscow, not as a prisoner, but as an asset. According to this theory, some have speculated that after the death of Stalin, he was silently eliminated. In 2001, the CIA file on Heinrich Müller was released, which proved, if the records are to be believed, that the CIA itself was never in contact with Müller after the war. Notably, in 1967, a man in Panama bore such a strong resemblance to Heinrich Müller that Müller's wife identified him as the former Gestapo chief. After fingerprint analyses were conducted, the man, who was facing extradition to West Germany, was released. He was definitively not Heinrich Müller, despite his appearance. And if you're one of those people who just listens, I've put a photograph of Müller up beside this Panamanian man. Personally, I find the resemblance between the two men disturbingly similar, but it looks as though this man simply had the misfortune of being born the doppelganger to Müller. On the morning of November 23, 1944, British anti-aircraft troops near Kortenberg in Belgium were startled to see a lone B-17 Flying Fortress bomber appearing out of the gray sky. It was heading straight toward them with its landing gear down, causing some concern amongst the British soldiers present. No flights were scheduled, so the soldiers on the ground assumed this heavy American aircraft must be in distress and attempting an emergency landing. The massive four-engine bomber came in fast and low, overshooting their position and plowing into a nearby field. Its landing was rough and uncontrolled. The B-17's propeller blades snapped off as they struck the earth, and both wings smacked the ground before the fuselage skidded to a halt. Miraculously, the Flying Fortress did not break apart or burst into flames. It came to rest battered but largely intact, a crash landing in one piece, with 3 of its engines still faintly rumbling on. The astonished RAF crew braced for the bomber's crew to emerge, ready to help any survivors out of the wreck. They waited for over 15 minutes, expecting at any moment to see dazed airmen climbing out of the downed plane, but nobody came out. After some time passed with no apparent movement, Major John Crisp, one of the British officers on site, decided he had to investigate. Major Crisp cautiously approached the silent B-17, unsure what he would find inside. He even worried the abandoned bomber might be some kind of German booby trap or trick, given the unusual circumstance. The airplane's engines were still sputtering, so Crisp clambered onto the fuselage and managed to reach the controls to shut off the throbbing motors. With the roar of the engines dying out, an eerie silence fell. Crisp then found a hatch on the underside of the aircraft, opened it, and pulled himself up into the belly of the bomber. What he discovered upon entering would shock him. There was no one inside, not a single soul. The B-17's interior showed clear signs of recent occupation by a crew, yet the men themselves had vanished. To appreciate just how extraordinary this situation was, one must understand the typical role of a B-17 and its crew in World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a heavy bomber employed by the United States Army Air Forces, used primarily in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. These stout aircraft, each usually manned by a crew of 10, flew from airfields in England on long-range missions to hit German military and industrial targets. They were capable of striking factories, railway yards, and oil refineries deep behind enemy lines, destroying the infrastructure of the crumbling Third Reich. B-17 crews endured fierce opposition on every sortie. Flying at high altitudes and tight formations, they were met with relentless anti-aircraft fire and increasingly limited swarms of enemy fighters. In the early years of the campaign, before long-range fighter escorts became common, American bomber losses were brutally high. In late 1943, the average B-17 had a life expectancy of only 11 missions, and its crew's odds were no better. Over the course of the war, these flying fortresses dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets, but this came at a great cost in men and machines. Some missions became infamous for their danger. For example, a single 1944 raid on the Mersburg-Leipzig oil complex was defended by 780 flak guns. In an astonishing fact, 56 American bombers were lost on that day alone. It wasn't uncommon for damaged bombers to limp back toward Allied lines, only to have their crews bail out when the aircraft could no longer stay aloft. Normally, however, if a crew had to abandon their B-17, the aircraft would eventually crash and be destroyed. None of the Allied soldiers in Belgium that day had ever seen a flying fortress make it back by itself, which is why the sight of that empty B-17 sitting in a field was so unbelievable. Inside the downed bomber, Major Crisp found plenty of evidence of its crew, but no crew members. Using a flashlight, he carefully moved through the fuselage and the cramped crew compartments. Later, Crisp would report that the most remarkable find was about a dozen parachutes wrapped up and ready to go. Every airman's parachute appeared to be present and packed, which made the absence of the crew even more baffling. If the men had jumped out, why were all their parachutes left on board? On the navigator's desk, Crisp found a code book and noted that the last entry scrawled in it read simply, "Bad flak." Scattered around were personal items, several fur-lined flying jackets, and even some half-eaten food. There were no signs of struggle or of any casualties. In fact, there was no blood and no damage from bullets or flak inside. Aside from the damage inflicted by the crash landing itself, the B-17 appeared surprisingly undamaged. This made the cryptic "bad flak" note even more puzzling, since whatever trouble the bomber had encountered in the air had left no visible holes or scars on the airframe. By this point, word of the strange crewless aircraft had spread among nearby Allied units. The abandoned flying fortress quickly earned a nickname, the Phantom Fortress. Investigators arrived to identify the ghost bomber and search for an explanation. They soon confirmed the plane's serial number and markings. It belonged to the 91st Bombardment Group, a veteran American unit based in England. The last mission flown by this B-17, before it decided to finish the trip alone, had been a raid on the oil refineries in Mersburg earlier that day. Somewhere between the target and Belgium, something clearly had gone very wrong. The pressing question remained: what happened to the crew? At first, some feared the men might have fallen out or met with a grim end. The untouched parachutes suggested that if anyone had bailed out during the flight, they did so without the very equipment that would have saved their lives. A breakthrough came not long after. Astonishingly, the entire crew was found alive and safe on the ground in Belgium. One by one, the American airmen from the Phantom Fortress were located and brought in by Allied personnel. Their appearance answered the biggest question. The men had parachuted out of the B-17 before it crash landed, but raised others. According to their report, the B-17 had developed a serious mechanical problem with its bomb rack while en route to the target, which prevented them from dropping their bombs. The pilots veered the plane out of formation to try to resolve the issue, but as they did so, they were hit by enemy fire. Bursting flak from German anti-aircraft weapons further damaged the bomb bay and knocked out at least one of the engines. The Flying Fortress began losing speed and altitude, unable to stay with the rest of the bomber group. With a crippled engine and possibly structural damage, the pilot set his sights on Allied territory in Belgium. As they crossed into friendly territory not far from Brussels, the pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. Following standard procedure, the pilot engaged the autopilot to hold the plane steady on a level course while the crew prepared to jump. One by one, all the crewmen clipped on their parachutes and bailed out from the struggling fortress at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. They all made it out successfully and their parachutes deployed. The men drifted down to safety and were soon rescued by Allied ground units who spotted them. The B-17, now completely unattended, surprisingly did not nosedive or spiral out of control as many damaged planes would. Instead, with the autopilot still engaged, the bomber continued to fly on its own. It slowly descended in a wide glide, maintaining a generally straight and level altitude. In an incredible twist of fate, the unmanned aircraft happened to come down near where Major Crisp's anti-aircraft unit was positioned. When Major Crisp compared the crew's story to what he found, some details didn't seem to line up neatly. The airmen had described serious flak damage and engine failures, yet the aircraft on the ground showed little evidence of battle damage. Those discrepancies were not unheard of in the chaos of combat. More puzzling was the matter of the parachutes. Crisp had found all those chutes neatly stowed, but the crew obviously had parachuted out. One likely explanation is that the parachutes Crisp found were spares, or crew chute packs that were left on board. Perhaps the crew grabbed different chutes, such as chest pack parachutes that attached to harnesses, and left the rest behind in their haste. It's also conceivable that in the confusion, Crisp tallied more parachutes than were actually standard issue for the crew. Whatever the case, the presence of unused parachutes on the Phantom Fortress has remained one of the quirks of the story. The fact that this B-17 landed itself without a crew was unprecedented, and there's no documented cases of it happening since. Some question if the mystery isn't how the plane landed, or the state of the plane and the parachutes, but whether this event happened at all. In my review of the evidence, I think it may be best to classify this one as based on a true story. A Flying Fortress did land itself in November 1944, and the crew did survive. However, everything else may be subject to embellishments over time, or to make the story more compelling. That said, to repeat a tired line that's overused for a reason, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Toward the end of World War II, Allied pilots began reporting strange lights pacing their aircraft during nighttime missions. These unexplained aerial phenomena were first noted in late 1944 by crews of the U.S. 415th Night Fighter Squadron operating over Western Europe. In one notable encounter in November 1944, pilot Edward Schluter and his crew witnessed a cluster of bright orange lights flying alongside them near the Rhine River. The lights, numbering about 8 to 10, moved swiftly and with uncanny agility. Despite attempts to track them on radar or engage them in combat, the mysterious lights would vanish and reappear, seemingly playing cat and mouse with the astonished airmen. News of these encounters spread through squadrons and even reached the press. By New Year's 1945, American newspapers had picked up the story of what pilots were calling Foo Fighters. The term Foo came from a popular comic strip of the era, Smokey Stover, where a fireman character quipped, "Where there's foo, there's fire." And yeah, personally, I don't really get the humor either. I guess it was a different time. Radar operator Donald Myers, a fan of the comic, coined the name Foo Fighters for these bizarre flying lights, and it quickly became the label for this wartime mystery. After the initial encounters, reports of Foo Fighters were not isolated to a single squadron or region. Allied airmen across the European theater, and even in the Pacific, described similar encounters. The typical Foo Fighter sighting involved one or several glowing orbs or fiery balls of light-tailing aircraft at high speed. Pilots described them as red, orange, white, or even green lights that could appear singly or in groups, occasionally arranged as if in formation. They often seemed to toy with the airplanes, matching maneuvers, circling, and making sudden turns or bursts of speed, far beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft of the time. What made Foo Fighters especially eerie to the crews was that despite their visual presence, the objects never appeared on radar screens. They emitted no recognizable radio signals, dropped no bombs, and never fired weapons. In fact, these glowing pursuers never caused direct harm in any way whatsoever. Still, they unnerved even veteran aviators. Many pilots initially suspected these could be some new enemy weapon, a remote-controlled device or an advanced fighter meant to harass or disorient Allied flyers. Yet, attempts to outmaneuver or shoot at the lights were futile. Foo Fighters would simply dart away or vanish abruptly. Eyewitnesses across different nationalities found commonality in their stories. Beyond American and British crews, even some German and Japanese pilots reportedly observed similar inexplicable lights during missions. This broader pattern suggested that Foo Fighters were not the handiwork of any one side in the conflict. By late 1944 and early 1945, Foo Fighter sightings had become frequent enough that military leadership took note, and official inquiries were set in motion to solve the mystery. As the phenomenon gained attention, various theories emerged to explain what these Foo Fighters might be. Military authorities and scientists of the era considered a range of possibilities, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. One scientific explanation was that the lights were simply a natural weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. This is a harmless discharge of plasma that can glow on aircraft wingtips or antennas during stormy conditions. St. Elmo's fire was familiar to pilots and sailors as a static electric effect that could produce a ghostly glow. However, many Foo Fighter sightings occurred in clear skies and described objects darting around in controlled ways, which did not fit the relatively static, flickering nature of St. Elmo's fire. Another weather-related candidate was ball lightning, an extremely rare and little understood spherical lightning manifestation. Ball lightning could, in theory, account for glowing orbs seen during thunderstorms. Yet, the Foo Fighters seemed to persist longer and move more deliberately than any documented ball lightning, which tends to last only seconds and doesn't chase airplanes over long distances. Further, ball lightning is extremely rare and doesn't travel in packs or respond with agency, as the Foo Fighters appeared to do. Psychological explanations were also put forward. Some suggested that war-weary pilots, exhausted from long missions and intense combat, might be hallucinating or misinterpreting ordinary lights as fantastical moving objects. Certainly, combat stress and fatigue can affect perception, and night flying can play tricks on even well-trained eyes. Indeed, the U.S. Navy was concerned enough to study night flying visual illusions in 1945, exploring how pilot fatigue could generate false sightings. However, this hypothesis of mere hallucinations didn't sit well with the airmen who experienced Foo Fighters. Many encounters involved multiple crew members seeing the same phenomenon simultaneously, which would be unlikely if it were all just in their individual minds. These pilots were also considered credible observers, skilled, alert men who, despite the stress of war, were capable of distinguishing optical illusions from real objects. They steadfastly refuted the idea that what they saw was a mirage or a result of battle nerves, especially given the consistency of reports across different crews and nights. Further, photographs of the Foo Fighters were also relatively common, indicating that at least some of the objects were more than mere hallucinations. Technological explanations abounded as well. Early speculation in Allied intelligence circles wondered if the Axis powers had developed a novel weapon or surveillance device. During World War II, Germany in particular was working on cutting-edge technology, including jet fighters and rocket-propelled aircraft. But those aircraft had distinct appearances and performance profiles, and none could perform the gravity-defying maneuvers attributed to Foo Fighters. These wonder weapons also didn't operate in the stealthy and radar-invisible way that characterized these glowing orbs. Furthermore, captured enemy documents and post-war interrogations of German scientists revealed no evidence of a secret program producing such phenomena. An alternative technological theory considered whether Foo Fighters could be a form of psychological warfare, perhaps bright flares or projected lights meant to confuse pilots. However, no one could explain the movement patterns of the Foo Fighters. With conventional explanations faltering, some turned to more exotic ideas. Even during the war, a few imaginative souls mused about otherworldly origins, suggesting that maybe these were visitors from beyond the earth, curious about our conflict. However, during the 1940s, such ideas were on the fringe and not taken seriously by military investigators. It was only after the war, especially with the flying saucer craze beginning in 1947, that people looked back at Foo Fighters with a new question. Curious minds began to question whether these were an early chapter in the modern history of UFO sightings. In hindsight, the resemblance is intriguing. Highly maneuverable lights and objects in the sky, defying easy explanation, playing tag with human aircraft. Indeed, many ufologists have claimed the Foo Fighters as part of the UFO phenomenon narrative, though this remains a controversial take. Over the years, a handful of writers even revived the speculation of advanced wartime technology, bordering on science fiction. For instance, stories about German Wunderwaffen and experimental flying discs have intertwined with UFO lore, though no concrete evidence ever emerged linking Foo Fighters to any such projects. By and large, the paranormal interpretation that Foo Fighters were extraterrestrial probes or spacecraft remained speculative and without proof. Yet the mystery around the wartime sightings certainly fed into the growing cultural fascination with UFOs. During and immediately after World War II, the Foo Fighter sightings prompted formal investigations. However, no conclusions were reached. Later, in 1953, as UFO sightings were garnering national attention, the CIA convened the Robertson Panel, a group of prominent scientists tasked with evaluating the UFO issue. Foo Fighters were directly mentioned in their deliberations. The Robertson Panel noted that they hadn't shown hostile intent, and considered whether natural phenomena could explain them. They suggested possibilities like electrostatic charges similar to St. Elmo's fire, electromagnetic effects, or even light reflections off ice crystals high in the atmosphere. None of these explanations was confirmed as the definitive answer. The panel famously remarked that had the term flying saucer been popular in 1944 and 1945, those pilots would likely have called the Foo Fighters by that now familiar name. The lack of clear answers meant that Foo Fighters lingered as an open case. And so, scientists and enthusiasts have continued to revisit the mystery. In recent years, some researchers have taken a fresh look armed with modern science. According to one hypothesis, the balls of light might form under certain conditions in the thermosphere and then descend to altitudes where warplanes fly. It was theorized that they were drawn by the plane's own electromagnetic emissions, or by atmospheric disturbances like thunderstorms, or even the radiation from wartime events. Such plasmas could potentially move erratically and appear and disappear, which aligns with many Foo Fighter reports. All that said, we're no closer to an explanation of Foo Fighters today than we were in 1945.